The notebooks were stacked by year inside a cedar chest at the foot of Winifred Alcott's bed, 40 of them in total, each one a plain, unremarkable composition book with a number written on the spine in her mother's careful hand. Delia Pruitt found them 3 weeks after the funeral, kneeling on her mother's bedroom floor in the late afternoon light, and opened the first one she reached almost at random, expecting diary entries or recipes, or the ordinary miscellany an elderly woman might have collected over a long life. Instead, she found a single line for each day, written in the same unhurried hand across 4 decades, never longer than a sentence, never shorter than a few careful words. March 14th, pale gold behind bare branches, gone by 6:52. March 15th, gray, rain the whole day, still counted. March 16th, orange bleeding into violet, best one this month. Delia turned page after page, notebook after notebook, and found the pattern unbroken. Every single evening, for as long as the notebook spanned, her mother had recorded, in a handful of words, exactly what the sunset had looked like that day. Not the weather generally, not her mood, or her plans, or anything else about the ordinary texture of her life. Only the sky, at the end of each day, described with the same brief, careful attention, year after year, without a single gap that Delia could find. She sat back on her heels, the cedar chest open in front of her, 40 years of her mother's evenings arranged in careful rows, and felt a specific, growing unease she couldn't yet name, the sense that she was looking at something considerably larger than an old woman's harmless habit, though she didn't yet understand what. She reached for the earliest notebook, its cover more worn than the others, and opened it to the first page. The date was 40 years earlier, almost to the week. Above the first sunset entry, in the same hand but noticeably younger, less settled, her mother had written a single additional line that appeared nowhere else in any of the following 39 notebooks. Dr. Halloran says 2 years, maybe less. I don't know what to do with that number. I am going to start noticing the sunsets instead. If I get more days than he thinks, I want to have proof I didn't waste them. Delia was 46 years old, a high school art teacher, married to a steady man named Owen, mother to 2 teenagers who had grown up thinking of their grandmother, without any particular scrutiny, as simply an unusually cheerful woman. The kind of person who commented on beautiful weather more than most people did, who kept a small collection of sunset photographs on her refrigerator, who had a specific, gentle habit of pausing mid-conversation on a porch some evenings to say, quietly, "Look at that," and then returning to whatever she'd been saying before. Delia had always understood this as simply her mother's personality, an easy, sunny disposition that had never required much explanation, the kind of pleasant eccentricity families absorb without asking too many questions. She had not known, until 3 weeks earlier, that her mother had been diagnosed at 34 with an aggressive cardiac condition, one that her doctor at the time had believed would very likely end her life within 2 years. She had not known that Winifred had kept this diagnosis almost entirely private, telling only her husband, Delia's father, and continuing to raise her 2 young children. Delia had been 6 at the time, without either of them ever suspecting that their mother was quietly living inside a prognosis that gave her, by her own doctor's estimate, very little time left at all. Delia herself had received news 4 months earlier that she had been trying, with only partial success, not to think about every day since. A routine scan had found something concerning. A biopsy had confirmed early-stage cancer, treatable, her own doctors had told her, with a strong likelihood of full recovery, though the specific uncertainty of the months ahead, the surgery still scheduled, the treatment still to come, had settled into her chest as a low, persistent static she hadn't found a way to quiet. She had told almost no one outside her immediate family. She had continued teaching, continued her ordinary routines, telling herself she didn't want the diagnosis to become the only thing people saw when they looked at her. She had not yet recognized, kneeling on her mother's bedroom floor with 40 years of sunsets spread in front of her, exactly how directly her own quiet, private uncertainty was about to be answered by the woman she had always assumed had simply been born unusually content. Delia thought back, sitting there, to 100 small memories she had never once examined closely. Winifred pulling the car over on ordinary drives home from the grocery store, saying only, "Give me a minute," and sitting quietly behind the wheel until the light had finished its work across the windshield. Winifred refusing, every single year, to schedule her own birthday dinner before 7 in the evening, no matter how inconvenient the hour was for relatives traveling in from out of town. Winifred's small collection of Polaroids taped inside her kitchen cabinet door, dozens of them, all sunsets, all slightly different, that Delia had always assumed were simply the harmless clutter of a woman who liked pretty pictures. None of it had ever struck Delia as strange enough to question directly. Her mother had always been the warmest, steadiest presence in any room, the parent other children's friends gravitated toward, the grandmother who never seemed rattled by chaos, who met bad news with a kind of unhurried calm that Delia, as a teenager, had sometimes found almost frustrating, wanting her mother to panic alongside her instead of simply saying gently, "We'll get through today, and then we'll get through tomorrow." She understood now, sitting on the floor with the weight of 40 notebooks around her, that this calm had not been an absence of fear. It had been a discipline, built and maintained, one evening at a time, against a fear so large that Winifred had apparently decided, at 34, she would either be consumed by it or she would find some small, repeatable way to hold it at arm's length without ever pretending it wasn't there. Delia read through the notebooks slowly over the following days, working forward chronologically from that first, trembling entry. The early notebooks carried a specific rawness beneath their brevity. April 2nd. Couldn't watch tonight. Too tired. Wrote this from memory of yesterday's instead. April 9th. Pink and gold. Sat outside even though it was cold. Didn't want to miss it in case there aren't many left. But the entries continued, month after month, past the 2-year mark her mother's doctor had given her, past the 5th year, the 10th. The tone shifted gradually, Delia noticed, from the specific urgency of someone counting down to something steadier, more settled, still attentive, still faithful to the ritual, but no longer written in the shadow of an ending that hadn't, in fact, arrived on schedule. She found a later entry, roughly 15 years into the collection, that addressed the shift directly. 15 years today since Dr. Halloran gave me 2. I don't fully understand why I'm still here, and the newer doctors don't fully understand it either. Not with any language more satisfying than, "Some people simply respond better than the statistics predict." I've stopped trying to understand it and started simply trying to keep the promise instead. Every sunset, whether it's beautiful or gray or hidden behind clouds, I count it either way. That was always the point. Not that every day would be beautiful, but that I would notice it regardless. Delia called her father, long divorced from her mother but still living nearby, and asked him directly what he remembered from that period. "She told me the diagnosis the week she got it," he said, his voice carrying an old, careful weight. "We were terrified. I remember she came home from that appointment and sat in the car in the driveway for almost an hour before she came inside. I found out later she'd pulled over on the way home too, sat in a parking lot watching the sky, unable to drive any further until the sun had finished setting. She told me that night that she'd decided to start noticing them, every one, for as long as she had left. I don't think either of us expected as long as she had left to turn into 40 more years." "Why didn't she ever tell us?" Delia asked. "Growing up, I never once knew any of this." "I think she didn't want you and your brother growing up in the shadow of a countdown," he said. "She wanted you to have an ordinary childhood, not one shaped by watching your mother brace for an ending that might arrive at any moment. I think the notebooks were where she put all of it instead. The fear, the gratitude, the specific discipline of choosing to notice beauty even on the days it felt impossible to. I think she needed somewhere private to keep counting, so the rest of her life could stay as normal as she could manage to make it. I remember her being sick sometimes," he said slowly, working through his own childhood memories with visible effort. "I remember a stretch when I was maybe 10, when she seemed tired all the time, and there were a lot of doctor's appointments she never explained. I just assumed it was ordinary grown-up stuff, nothing that concerned us. I had no idea it was ever that serious. I had no idea she was living with a countdown the entire time we were growing up. Do you think Dad should have told us sooner?" Once it became clear she'd survived past it? Delia asked. Martin considered this for a long moment. I don't think I'm angry, if that's what you're asking, he said finally. I think I understand why they made the choice they made. I think I'm mostly just sitting here trying to recalculate an entire childhood I thought I understood completely, and realizing there was this whole enormous thing happening underneath it the entire time, invisible to both of us. Delia asked her mother's longtime cardiologist's office, still operating under new doctors decades later, whether any of the old records had survived. A young physician, reviewing what remained of the file, told her gently that the original diagnosis had indeed been severe, and that later scans across the following decades showed a condition that had, remarkably and without any clear medical explanation the file could offer, essentially stabilized far earlier and far more completely than anyone treating her at the time would have predicted. Sometimes that happens, the doctor said carefully. We don't always have a satisfying reason why. Some patients simply respond in ways the statistics can't fully account for. Delia did not press him for more certainty than that. She understood, reading her mother's own notebooks, that Winifred herself had stopped needing a tidy explanation somewhere around her 15th surviving year, choosing instead to simply keep the promise she had made, regardless of whatever medical mystery had allowed her to keep making it. Delia visited her mother's closest surviving friend, a woman named Harriet who had known Winifred since their 20s, the following week, carrying one of the notebooks with her as a kind of proof, though Harriet, it turned out, needed none. She told me the same week she told your father, Harriet said, sitting across from Delia in her small, sunlit living room. We were only 29, 30, that age when nothing feels like it's supposed to end yet. I remember she called me crying, the kind of crying where you can barely get the words out, and then, not 2 days later, she called again completely composed and told me she'd decided something. She said, I'm not going to spend whatever time is left being afraid every single minute. I'm going to find one thing each day that's actually true and actually beautiful, and I'm going to make myself notice it, whether I feel like it or not. I thought it sounded almost too simple to matter. I didn't understand, until years later, watching her keep it up through every hard year that followed, exactly how much strength a habit that simple could actually require. Did she ever tell you she regretted keeping it from us? Delia asked. Harriet considered this carefully. Once, she said, about 10 years in, once it had become clear she might genuinely be defying the original prognosis, she told me she sometimes wondered if she'd made the wrong choice, protecting you and your brother from the truth instead of letting you understand what she was actually living through. But she also said that watching you both grow up without that particular fear shadowing your childhoods was, in the end, its own kind of gift she'd been glad to give you, even if it meant carrying the weight alone. Delia found herself returning to the notebooks most evenings that week, reading a year at a time, watching her mother's private, unbroken discipline stretch across 4 decades of ordinary days. Days that included, Delia now understood, her own birth, her brother's wedding, the ordinary griefs and joys of a full life lived, all of it quietly counted against a diagnosis that had never actually caught up with her. She thought, increasingly, about her own quiet dread regarding the coming weeks, the surgery, the treatment, the specific uncertainty she had been carrying largely alone, telling herself she didn't want it to become the only thing people saw. She mentioned this finally to Owen one evening, the notebooks spread across their own kitchen table. I think I've been handling this the opposite way she did, Delia admitted. She found something to notice every single day, on purpose, as a way of staying present inside the fear instead of just enduring it. I think I've mostly just been trying not to think about it at all, which isn't the same thing as being brave. I think it's just avoidance wearing a calmer expression. What do you think she'd tell you to do? Owen asked gently. Delia looked at the most recent entries in the final notebook, written only weeks before her mother's death. Still faithful, still brief, still counting. Soft gray today, no real color, but I sat outside anyway. 40 years of these now. I don't know how many are left. I've stopped needing to know. I think she'd tell me to start noticing something, Delia said slowly. Not to fix the fear, just to have something steady to hold on to while it's still there. She began, the following week, a version of her mother's own ritual, not sunset specifically, but a single brief line each evening, describing one true specific thing from the day, regardless of how difficult or ordinary it had been. Some entries were small. Owen made the soup I like, didn't feel like eating but did anyway. Others carried more weight. Surgery scheduled for the 14th. Told my brother today. He cried. I didn't, not until after he left. She found, within the first several weeks, that the practice did not remove the fear, exactly, the way she had half hoped it might. But it gave the fear somewhere specific to sit each night, instead of circulating endlessly through every unoccupied moment of her days. Owen noticed the shift before Delia did. The specific way she seemed to breathe a little easier by the time she closed each evening's notebook, even on the nights when the sentence she wrote was hard rather than hopeful. You seem steadier, he told her one night, watching her cap her pen. Not less scared, just steadier inside it. Delia thought about this for a long time before answering. I think that might be exactly what she was after too, she said finally. Not to stop being afraid, just to have one small, certain thing to do with the fear each day, instead of carrying it around formless the rest of the time. Delia's surgery took place on a clear afternoon in early spring, and in the recovery that followed, she asked Owen to wheel her chair to a window each evening, regardless of how she was feeling, so that she could watch whatever the sky was doing and write down a single line before the day closed. Some entries, in that difficult stretch, were only a few words. Gray again, counted anyway. Others carried the specific, hard-won relief of good news arriving in increments. Doctor says the margins look clean. Sunset was orange. I cried at both. There were harder nights too, ones she nearly skipped entirely. An evening after a difficult round of follow-up scans when the waiting for results had worn her down to something close to despair. When she told Owen she didn't think she had it in her to watch anything, let alone write about it. He had wheeled her to the window anyway, without pressing her to do more than simply sit there, and after several silent minutes she had picked up the notebook on her own and written only 4 words. Still here, still watching. She had cried afterward, but she had also, she noticed, felt something in her chest loosen very slightly, the way her mother's own entries had described feeling on the days when the ritual seemed hardest and mattered most. She thought, often during those weeks, about her mother sitting in a parking lot 40 years earlier, unable to drive home until the sky had finished changing color, making a private, unwitnessed promise to notice her remaining days rather than simply survive them. She understood now, in a way she hadn't fully grasped reading the notebooks from the outside, exactly how much discipline that promise had required. Not a single dramatic act of courage, but a small, repeated choice, made new every single evening for 40 years, regardless of whether the sky offered anything beautiful to reward the noticing. She finished her treatment that summer, her doctors cautiously optimistic, the specific uncertainty of the preceding months gradually loosening into something closer to ordinary life. She kept the nightly practice going regardless, understanding that she no longer needed a diagnosis hanging over her to make the noticing worthwhile. She gathered her own notebooks, 3 of them by the following spring, and set them on the shelf beside her mother's 40, side by side, 2 generations of the same quiet discipline, begun under very different circumstances but rooted, she had come to believe, in exactly the same understanding, that gratitude doesn't require good news to be genuine, only attention. She began, in the months that followed, bringing a small version of the practice into her own classroom, closing each Friday's art class by asking her students to spend the final 5 minutes simply describing, in a single sentence, one true thing they had noticed that week. Not necessarily beautiful, just real, just seen clearly. Some students found the exercise strange at first, unaccustomed to an assignment with no clear right answer. Others, she noticed over the following months, began arriving on Fridays with their sentence already prepared, having apparently spent the week watching for something worth reporting. She never told them the full story behind the practice. She simply offered it, the way her mother's own discipline had quietly been offered to her, without explanation, for her entire life. until a cedar chest finally revealed what it had actually been protecting all along. On the 1-year anniversary of her mother's death, Delia sat outside on her own porch as the light began to change. Her family gathered loosely around her the way Winifred's had once gathered around their own mother without fully understanding what she was quietly counting. Her daughter, 16 now, sat beside her, watching the sky with the specific patience Delia had spent the past year deliberately modeling rather than simply hoping her children would absorb on their own. "Why do you do this every night?" her daughter asked. "Grandma did it too, right?" I found some of her notebooks in the cedar chest. Delia considered the question, watching the color deepen over the rooftops across the street. "Your grandmother found out, a very long time ago, that she might not have very much time left," she said. "She decided, instead of just being afraid every day, that she would notice something real every day instead. I think she believed those were two different things, even though they can happen at the same time. I got a little bit of the same scare myself this past year, and I think I finally understood what she meant once I actually tried it myself." "Are you scared now?" her daughter asked. "Sometimes," Delia said honestly, "but I've learned that being scared and still noticing the sunset aren't opposites. I think that's what she was trying to teach us all those years without ever actually explaining it out loud. Some fears don't go away just because you write down something beautiful next to them, but I don't think they have to win either, just because they're there." Her son, 18 now and rarely one to linger on the porch for these evening rituals, sat down on the step below them, unprompted. "I never really got why you and Grandma did this," he admitted. "I thought it was just like a nice hobby. I didn't know it was about anything." "I don't think it has to be about anything for you," Delia said. "Maybe it will be someday, and maybe it won't. I think that's all right either way. I think the point was never to explain it to the next person, just to keep doing it faithfully enough that eventually, if they ever needed it, it would already be there waiting for them." She looked out at the sky, orange bleeding slowly into a deep, unhurried violet, and thought about her mother sitting in a parking lot 40 years earlier, too devastated to drive, deciding, in that single unwitnessed moment, to keep counting anyway. Orange into violet, she thought, already composing tonight's line before the color had even finished changing. Gone by 7:48, still counted. Some promises, she understood now, are never spoken aloud to anyone. They are simply kept, quietly and completely, one ordinary evening at a time, for as long as a life allows. And sometimes, if you are patient enough to go looking, decades later, in a cedar chest at the foot of a bed, someone finally gets to see exactly how faithfully that promise was honored, one small, unremarkable sentence at a time.